Good morning, April 22nd, 2017, and wanted to offer some observations on life and particularly of the system that we live in. I'm going to depict this system by the circle and making some observations of trends that occur, similar trends that occur at various scales of complexity. So considering the human system, for instance, and particularly of different states of being within this human system, one can perhaps see that if one were in a state of lethargy, that lethargy can be overcome by a state of assertiveness, and that assertiveness can be overcome by a state of intelligence. So there's a trend whereby any human system can increase its degrees of freedom by going through these states of what I'll depict as the physical to the vital to the mental. Looking at the similar trend across another level of complexity and a different time scale spanning centuries, we can see that the nature of economy has changed from the agricultural economy to the industrial economy to the digital economy, and that, I would argue, is a similar trend from the physical to the vital to the mental. And looking at a different level of complexity of that of meta theory, one can perhaps say that those theories that are based solely on the physical observation of things yield some power, but not as much as those that are based on the dynamic observation of things across time and space, and perhaps not as much as those theories that are based on a conceptual model of things. So we see a similar degree of freedom that is afforded to those systems that are based on conceptual as opposed to physical observation. Now, while these are just three similar observations at different levels of complexity, there's adequate research that shows that no matter where we look, we can see similar trend of development taking place. So the question is, what does this trend, this similar trend, really tell us about the system, the living system that we live in? Now, no matter which geography or which history we're looking at, we may say that for this trend to have surfaced means that there's an incredible amount of resistance or opposition that's been overcome. So the system that we live in has something that we may call power. So there's an incredible amount of power in this living system to overcome this or allow this trend to emerge no matter where we're looking at. Similarly, we may say that there's an incredible amount of knowledge in the system that we live in, because the fact that this trend can surface and the right circumstance or the right instrument be chosen or be present at that right time, right place for this trend to surface means that there's perhaps an implicit knowledge in our system. Similarly, you may say that wherever there's an implicit characteristic of service in the system, in that wherever this trend can occur, the system precipitates its occurrence. So there's something, the system is at the service of the parts to allow this greater degrees of manifest or degrees of freedom to manifest. And similarly, there's some kind of nurturing or harmony that's an implicit characteristic of the system, whereby it wants each of its parts to develop, to nurture them so that they may experience a greater degree of freedom. So we see that just from observation of these various trends of development that occur in time, that there's an implication for the characteristic or the essence of space which has these qualities embedded in it. But let's look at some practical examples and see how perhaps what we see happening in time and its implication in space or the structure of space actually influences the structure of space. So let's consider, for example, the nature of light. Now, light, as we experience it here in the physical realm, has a finite speed of 186,000 miles per second in vacuum. But because of that finite speed, there's a past, a present, a future, and a sense of connection that is established. But when we consider the past, present, and future, we'll see that the past indicates to us this kind of petal of service, in that everything that we see around us is a result of the past. That is a result of everything that the system has served to all its parts. If we consider the present, we see that it's a petal from this family of power, because from all the various possibilities, there's a set of vital forces that interact, and perhaps the strongest force that emerges. The future is a function of knowledge, in that there is something implicit in the seed of life that shows itself through time. And there's a sense of connection between isolated matters, islands of matter, that point to this connection, which is part of this petal or family of harmony. But how does this show up in terms of the layers of matter that perhaps are created in our system that further point to or give us insight into the structure of space? So we can see that, just considering the electromagnetic spectrum, for instance, that we have in the electromagnetic spectrum many different combinations of wavelength and frequency, and this combination of wavelength and frequency create different archetypes for different kinds of rays that exist, whether visible light, to the infrared, ultraviolet, X-rays, gamma rays, and so on. So there's an embeddedness of knowledge in the electromagnetic spectrum that shows up as this combination of frequency and wavelength. There's the speed with which this electromagnetic spectrum travels, the speed c, that allows a sense of connection between all the different things that emerge in that electromagnetic spectrum. So there's a sense of harmony that's created. There is the basis of the emergence of particles or matter that is also a function of the electromagnetic spectrum. And there's a basis of power from the gradient of frequencies that exist in this electromagnetic spectrum. So we're seeing that this structure of space has embedded in it these four families or these four essences that are of the essence of space. Looking at the architecture of quantum particles, we see that there's quarks that define protons in atoms, that define how any element will act in the universe. And so quantum particles have these quarks that's of the essence of knowledge. Similarly, there's a Higgs boson that provides mass to any particle that has mass, that's of the family of service. There's leptons, another part of the fundamental architecture of quantum particles that are apart from power. And then we have bosons that provide the harmony between, or the ability for different particles, fundamental particles, to connect to form larger islands of matter, atoms and so on. If you look at the level of atoms itself, we see that there are 4 fundamental orbital shells, and these orbital shells are also arranged as per this essential structure of space. So when we look at this notion of power, the s orbital elements such as hydrogen and helium that power suns can be thought of belonging to this family. When we consider service, we have d orbital elements that belong to this family. Knowledge, the p orbital elements, and harmony, f orbital elements. Going up another level of complexity, when we think about cells, we have polysaccharides which form an essential molecular plan within cells that powers all cells. We have proteins, the essential molecular plan of service within a cell. We have nucleic acids that house, in a sense, the knowledge within a cell. And we have lipids that create the essential harmonies or compartments within cells by which different parts can interrelate to form the living aspect of a cell. So what we see is that the structure of space is organized by this essential qualities or essences of the system. But if we think a little further, we'll see that none of these in isolation can really create the basis for the next level of matter to emerge. So all of these have to act in unison at each level. So when we look at quantum particles, all 4 have to act through a sense of unification or love. And this is true of every subsequent layer of emergence within this system. Now, when we reflect on this scheme, what we see is that something that emerged in time gave us a clue to the essences of the qualities of space. And then when we abstracted or consider these qualities in space, we can derive a scheme or construct a scheme for the emergence of matter at various levels of complexity, starting from the invisible or from the nature of light to the barely visible, so half the scale of the universe, at the structure of a cell. And these 4 parts that animate each of these different layers of complexity of matter have to act together to essentially give us a clue, another clue, that there's a basis of love that animates everything that has risen out of the invisible to become visible. So when we think about our living system, we see that it's a manifestation of love, and we find that this love has created everything that we are, that we see around us. And that if there is any further sustainable development that is going to take place, it also has to follow this essential thrust of love that exists and that has created the system that we live in.